How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the TAPED podcast, the most silky podcast in the world. We're your hosts, as always, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And welcome back to another edition of the album recap series, where we obviously talk about a batch of albums that we thought were noteworthy from a certain month, and in this case, obviously, we are covering November. We're like halfway through December right now, so apologies for this being so late, but it's whatever. There's only 12 albums on this one, actually. November is usually a slow month anyway, so that's to be expected, but, we have albums here, and yeah, if you're familiar with how this goes, then we'll just jump right into it. So, you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so first album that we're going to be talking about today is Valentine by Snail Mail. This is the sophomore album from the Maryland indie rock band fronted by Lindsey Jordan, Snail Mail, which is being released through Matador Records. Valentine is the first project that I'm ever hearing from Snail Mail. I heard about them before, though, even though, this is the only album I've ever heard from them. I've seen their album Lush here and there, and I know that indie heads really like that record. I didn't really have much expectations going into this new album here, and after giving it a listen, I can't really say that I thought it was that good, and it kind of comes off like your run-of-the-mill indie rock, indie pop album to me. To highlight what I did like, though, I think that Lindsey's vocals, while nothing that are great, are certainly solid, throughout, especially the more raspy aspects of her voice. There's some very good moments of songwriting on a few tracks here, and the final track is fantastic, and that is the true highlight of the album for me. But there are big issues that go against the album itself and my enjoyment of it. For one, I just don't really think that Snail Mail's style and sound is all that interesting or creative. It just blends into your typical indie rock and indie pop sound with very little that makes it stand out to me. The production, while pleasant, isn't all that enthralling or exciting. It often just sounds bland, and whenever it doesn't, it just sounds kind of overblown, like on the opening track. The instrumentals are just average at best to me, and most of the tracks just don't really excite me or do anything for me, really. The final track being the exception, obviously. I can't really say that I found too much about Snail Mail's sophomore album Valentine to be all that fulfilling apart from the final track. There just isn't really much about this band's sound and songwriting that's all that interesting. And it comes off like, obviously, your typical bland indie rock and indie pop affair. It's not bad, but it's just very average, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I am quite a big fan of Lindsey's previous albums. I definitely like Lush a lot. I also really like her Habit EP. It's one of my favorite EPs of the last decade or so. So yeah, obviously, whenever it comes to new material from Snail Mail, I'm always going to be on board and excited. And while Valentine isn't really mapping anything unexplored or truly innovative within its sound in the grand scheme of indie rock, I still think it's a commendable album and an evolution of sorts for Lindsey and company. It's far more somber and intricate instrumentally, and it feels like a more sophisticated and classy approach to Lindsey's sound, without ever leaving behind the charm and the lyrical intricacies that came with their previous records. And it seriously is still a good album. I don't want to, there is a lot more complaining than positives here. So I still want to make it clear that I do like this album, but it just feels like it loses a lot of that magic, a lot of the real substance that was on her previous albums. It just doesn't really have the playfulness of her previous albums, and in return, it's an album that I definitely am going to come back to a lot less. However, again, I still think it's a good album overall. It still has some great moments, and I think the thing that really shines on here is Lindsey's songwriting more so than anything. The instrumentals, I mean, I do enjoy, but a lot of the time they can kind of be very forgettable and just a little nondescript, but I think Lindsey's songwriting remains very solid throughout and remains kind of an anchor that keeps this album together. Overall, I mean, it's a good album. If you're a fan of Snail Mail, I think there's material on here to enjoy, but I don't think many people would claim that this is better than Lush. And in my opinion, it's also not better than her Habit EP.
Fair enough. My favourite track from Valentine is Mia. My least favourite track is the title track, and I gave this album a decent 5.
My favourite tracks are Valentine, Headlock, and Forever. My least favourite track is Si et al. I don't know how I would say that. I gave this album a light 6.
Alright, next up we have An Evening with Silk Sonic by Silk Sonic. This is the long-awaited debut album from soul duo Silk Sonic, consisting of Bruno Mars and Anderson .Paak. Silk Sonic is probably one of the most unexpected musical partnerships in recent memory, but ever since the duo released the first single under this moniker back in March, the music world has been highly anticipating what the two could come up with in an album setting, and after 8 months of waiting, as well as 2 more singles to keep us satisfied, it's finally here. Now, out of the 2 artists in Silk Sonic, I've heard much more from Anderson .Paak, who has shown himself to be an incredibly varied and charismatic artist, and on the other hand, Bruno Mars is someone who I've been familiar with ever since I was a kid, but I've never went out my way to listen to any of his albums. I've only heard some of the big hits from years ago, some of which are kind of shite in retrospect, if we're being honest here. Prior to An Evening with Silk Sonic being released, I had heard the 2 singles, well, 2 of them, Leave the Door Open and Skate, which, and with those singles in mind, I was very excited to see this, to hear this Silk Sonic record and how it would turn out, and if it would truly live up to the hype and quality that was set forth for it. And it absolutely does, in my opinion, since An Evening with Silk Sonic is just a great listen through and through. Silk Sonic presents us with a great ode to the world of 70s soul, and with its tight track list, it leaves very little filler, and as a result, it's all killer when it comes to the incredibly lush production, effortless instrumentation, and fantastic performances from Bruno and Anderson. Let's just start with the production, since it's straight up fantastic all the way through. Everything on here is sounding incredibly crisp, and the rich sound palette lends itself well to the layered instrumentation and the lush textures, and I'm here for it since the sound of this thing truly lives up to the name Silk Sonic. The sounds we find in this album range from the nostalgic sounds of 70s smooth soul to pop soul to funk and to R&B, all of which are done justice by everyone involved, and each respective track has just some fantastic things to offer in terms of sound and mood, and instrumentally it's just so smooth, it's effortlessly smooth. Of course, the main reason why we're all here for this project is for the 2 masterminds behind Silk Sonic, Bruno Mars and Anderson .Paak, who both sound like they're in their fucking element on here. They display some excellent chemistry when it came to the singles I heard, and thankfully that chemistry lends itself well to the rest of the album. They both have 2 different approaches, but they do such an amazing job at being able to convey the smooth swagger and heart that this album thrives in. And we get consistently outstanding performances from them both. Every song in this album is just as good as the very last, and the highlights are truly amazing. I wish there was more from this album track-wise, but hey, I won't complain, we're still getting a satisfying LP. Overall, An Evening with Silk Sonic manages to live up to the hype in my opinion, and it's well and truly a great album to my ears. It's lush, it's a fantastic homage to 70s soul, and Silk Sonic might just have managed to cram their way into my year-end lists just at the nick of time. It's lush, it's sensual, it's smooth, it's rich, and most of all, it's great.
An Evening with Silk Sonic sees both Bruno Mars and Anderson .Paak come together to create the best thing either of them have ever done, in my opinion. This album is just incredibly addicting. It's meticulously crafted, and it's just such a well put together tribute to 70s smooth soul, while also being one of the best examples of said genre I've heard ever. Bruno Mars's and Paak's energy is really the catalyst for everything that goes right on this project. Their chemistry, their synergy is just immense. The 2 were just made for each other. They complement each other's style perfectly, each other's voice perfectly. Their harmonies are perfect. Their lyrics are just so playful, and they just both exude just so much charisma and confidence throughout this project that it's impossible to hate this project. And as I said, it really does display a chemistry that you wouldn't really typically find in 2 major artists that are coming together for a collab. This is the kind of chemistry that you'd expect from artists that have been working together for decades, or at least for years. But Bruno and Anderson .Paak both had their own successful thing going on, and the fact that they could merge together to create something so seamless is just fantastic. The instrumentation on here is just so smooth, it's pristine, it's just filled with so much passion and charisma that it's bound to go down as a defining album of the decade. It just feels like an album where every single song could just be an absolute hit. Every song is just fire. It's a fantastic project. It's a really well crafted project. Again, I mean, it does sometimes feel like a tribute, and it wears that on its sleeve, but I mean, it's not the most original thing ever, but I don't think that really matters when the songs are this well written, when the instrumentation is just this pristine, when the vocal harmonies and vocals are just this fantastic. It's a great album, and it's definitely one of my favorites of the month, of the year. Yeah.
Fuck yeah, dude. Alright, my favourite tracks from An Evening with Silk Sonic are Leave the Door Open, Put on a Smile, Smoking Out the Window, and 777. My least favourite track, if I had to pick one, would be After Last Night, and I gave this album a decent 8.
My favourite tracks are Leave the Door Open, 777, and Skate. My least favourite track is After Last Night, and I gave this album a light 8.
Okay, moving on, we have Red, Taylor's version by Taylor Swift. This is the newest album from an artist who doesn't really need an introduction, Taylor Swift. And this is the long-awaited re-recording of her 2012 album, Red. Now, we've covered Taylor Swift a fair amount throughout our podcast inception, and we most notably mentioned albums like Evermore and Folklore, and most recently her re-recording of Fearless, which, I really liked when it came out, and I think that it's great that Taylor is going ahead and reclaiming the masters of her music. Now, despite my enjoyment of these albums, I've never really had that much of a strong opinion of her work, and I haven't heard a project from her that, absolutely wows me. I do like her work, but I just have yet to hear the album that just blows my fucking mind, I hope that the project would actually be... Sorry, excuse me. I hope that the project would actually be, that project would be the original recording of her seminal album Red, which was easily one of her most beloved albums in her discography, and it's the one that I often see get huge praise from people. But to be honest, I'm very indifferent towards the original Red. Not that I dislike it or thought it was bad, far from it actually, but for me, Red just seems like a product of its time that hasn't aged all that well when it comes to its more synthetic songs, and its more bare moments, while very good, are way too redundant for their own good, in my opinion. I hope these issues that I had with Red would be resolved with its re-recording, much like Fearless, and I hope that the bulk of extra material on here would be enough to make a very good album at the very least. Well, it's a demanding listen, given it's 30 tracks and 2 hours and 5 minutes long, but I was honestly quite excited to see what Taylor could do with her version of Red, but to be honest, I'm probably just as indifferent to Taylor's version as much as the original. There's certainly things that it does right and better than the original, but I still have my criticisms. To start with the positives, I feel like the modernized production of Taylor's version is done well, particularly for the acoustic and Heartland rock inspired tracks, which are probably my favourite moments on the album. Much like Fearless, the From the Vault tracks have some great moments and great guest appearances from Chris Stapleton, Phoebe Bridgers, and Ed Sheeran, and Taylor's songwriting from this era remains as potent as it did back when she released the original Red. But for everything I liked about this album, there were just some issues that I have with it, both of which come from the original criticisms that I had for the original album, as well as newfound issues that I have with the new recording. For one, I think that the more synthetic tracks, which also happen to be some of the biggest hits from this album, are still kind of dated, and even with the crisper production applied, and I still don't really like these songs that much. And I guess I feel like they sound way better on the original Red, because, it feels of its time, and the modernized sound just doesn't really work for them, in my opinion. And also, I think the way that Taylor's vocals are mixed feel kind of removed from the new versions. It doesn't sound right to me, and I'm not that big on them, to say the least. Secondly, I still think that the structure of the more acoustic and Heartland songs are a bit predictable and often redundant. Oh, Christ, kill me. None of the From the Vault tracks that sound like this have these issues, but it mostly comes down to the original album songs, to be honest. And finally, this just isn't really an album I'm going to go out of my way to listen to all that much, to be honest. I mean, given its length, I definitely won't, but I guess there was just only a few moments on here that made me think I'll revisit them. I mean, it's whatever, but at least I took away a few tracks from the new version. Overall, I'm mixed on Taylor's version of Red. It most certainly has its potent moments and fantastic tracks, but its sometimes dated nature, poor production choices, and lengthy track list doesn't make it something that I'd want to go back to frequently. The songs that I like from this thing are great, no denying that, but yeah, I guess I'm not feeling Red generally. Sorry, not sorry, I guess. Don't murder me.
On Red, Taylor continues her journey to reclaim all of her old albums, and this was a re-recording that I was definitely anticipating. Red is definitely one of her more popular albums, and it contains a lot of my favorite Taylor Swift songs. The original Red does, So I was excited to hear how Taylor would tackle those tracks as well as the more mainstream popular tracks that a lot of us are very familiar with, for better or for worse. And I think she tackles it pretty well. I do agree with you that the source material, it doesn't really deviate much from the source material. So the tracks like, I Knew You Were Trouble, for example, that weren't very good in the first place, don't really get any better on here. But the more somber, more intricate tracks on this album, like State of Grace, for example, my favorite Taylor Swift song of all time, is just made perfectly on here, and I think it's elevated even more so than it was on the original. It has a more anthemic and just epic feel to it, and a lot of this album just it is pretty much the source material but improved on. That's the first half of this album. It doesn't make any songs that were not great any more not great, but it does add upon her previous ideas with some of the better songs. However, it's the latter half of this album where the From the Vault tracks appear that is, to me, the most interesting part of this album, because a lot of the material on here is genuinely very good. The collab with Phoebe Bridgers is definitely noteworthy, and especially the 10-minute version of All Too Well, which is just absolutely incredible. It's one of the best songs of the year. It's like a top 5 song of the year in my opinion, and it just is just a hauntingly beautiful song near the end of the album. But overall, I mean, if you're a fan of the original Red, I think it's just an upgraded version of that, but I think it shares a lot of flaws with the original version still.
Fair enough. My favourite tracks from Red, Taylor's version, are Treacherous, Everything Has Changed, and I Bet You Think About Me. My least favourite track is I Knew You Were Trouble, and I gave this album a strong 5.
My favourite tracks are State of Grace, Holy Ground, and All Too Well 10-minute version. My least favourite track is I Knew You Were Trouble, and I gave this album a light 7 out of 10.
Alright, next up we have Crawler by Idols. This is the 4th studio album from the UK-based post-punk and art punk band Idols. Ever since I first listened to 2018's Joys and Active Resistance, Idols has slowly but surely climbed the ranks in becoming one of my favourite bands of the past few years. Their sound is aggressive, it's abrasive, it's in your face, it's rowdy, and punk to the core. But like many punk bands, they had something to say and stand for, and Idols stood for the progressive and outspoken leftist ideals with a bluntness and brutality that feels unique to them. Joe Talbot's savage vocals made the listener wary of these unapologetically blunt ideas, and he made sure that you wouldn't forget them, since his presence matches the very thunderous and beefy instrumentation. Crawler is coming out over a year after their previous album, Ultramono, which was a record that is certainly flawed. With more listens past my initial review of it, I began to notice them, but I still really loved it for being one of Idol's most abrasive and heavy records to date, while maintaining, memorable and catchy songs. And with that, we move on to their latest album, Crawler, which is being co-produced by the one and only Kenny Beats, surprisingly. Kenny did work with Idols on Ultramono, but I didn't expect him to co-produce an entire album with them already. Either way, I was still pretty excited to hear this, despite not hearing any of the singles. After listening to it a couple of times now, I can safely say that I think this is a good album. It's nice to see Idols trying new things, and even if it falls flat in a few cases, I still enjoy most of it. In many ways, Crawler feels like a return to the intensity and dynamic sounds in that Joys and Active Resistance had, but at the same time, we see Idols starting to branch out and experiment a little with some sounds and moods that they haven't really toyed with in the past. There's some tracks on here that showcase a more dreary side to Idols. There's some tracks on here that take influence from, surprising styles and lots of styles of old, like Rockabilly on the Wheel and, the soul undertones of the Beachland Ballroom, the latter of which probably being one of the most cathartic and potent Idols tracks ever. There's also tracks that still have that usual post-punk that we'd expect from Idols, but the tracks are usually those tracks honestly are probably one of the more uninteresting of the bunch, since they feel sort of forgettable and run-of-the-mill for Idols. The tracks where they branch out into different sounds are done very well in my opinion, and they end up being some of the best tracks on Crawler. The production is consistently very good throughout its runtime. It's more or less how you'd expect Idols to sound, and for me it lends itself well to the instrumentation and the performances, since it's fairly clean and well balanced throughout, not to mention the tones on this album are particularly gnarly, which I can respect heavily. The only issues that Crawler suffers from is the fact that the latter half of the album isn't very memorable. These tracks are just idols kind of doing their thing, but with a little passion and drive that made some of their most memorable tracks fiery or memorable. And while the songwriting is certainly way better at times, it's just not really finding its way into my brain that much. It's kind of one ear out the other in some cases. Outside of all that though, Crawler is another good effort from Idols. It's interesting to see them expand upon different ideas and moods while some of these ideas were certainly executed well, the uninspired cuts do leave a lot to be desired in some respects.
Idols are one of my favorite bands of the last few years. So it's really not easy to say this, but in my opinion, Crawler was a bit of a disappointment. I don't think it's a bad album, but to me, it's easily their weakest and just messiest album to date. There's moments on this project that just, completely match the sheer ferocity and intensity of their previous records and, expand on some new and interesting ideas. But there's also a lot of tracks where that ferocity just doesn't seem matched. There's no real nuance to the ideas that are being presented. And it just comes off as rather undercooked and at times sometimes substanceless, which is quite the contrast to, tracks like Car Crash. Cars like... Yeah, I'm going to talk about my favourite cars now.
I love the Nissan
Micra.
Fiat 500.
Yeah, which is quite the contrast to tracks like Car Crash or, the Beachland Ballroom, which is just, those are some of the most interesting and unique tracks that they've ever released. The latter of which is certainly one of the most intricate songs in their entire discography and just a massive creative progression for the band. But while there are moments of progression, there's also moments that to me just feel like regression. The track, The New Sensation, is just tastelessly abrasive, and a few other moments like Stockholm Syndrome or King Snake just feel really unmemorable, and it feels like they're covering absolutely no new ground. As a whole, it's still, I think, an enjoyable project, and it still has its moments. And throughout this album, you're not going to really find any bad tracks per se. Maybe The New Sensation, but that's about it. But I just don't think it's on the same level as Ultramono. I don't think it's on the same level as Brutalism, and I definitely don't think it's on the same level as what the fuck?
A Joy is an act of resistance.
Joy. I was thinking of Joyce Manor. I don't know why. My brain is fried. It's an okay album. It's far from peak Idols.
L for the Stockholm Syndrome slander. Fucking hell. Alright, never mind. My favourite tracks on Crawler are Car Crash, Stockholm Syndrome, Syndrome, what am I even saying? And the Beachland Ballroom. That song is like a top 5 song of the year for me. And worst track is Meds, and I gave this album a decent 7. My favourite tracks are Car Crash, the Beachland Ballroom, and my least favourite track is The New Sensation. I give this album a light 6. Alright, next up we have The Nearer the Fountain, More Pure the Stream Flows by Damon Albarn. This is the sophomore album from English singer-songwriter and producer Damon Albarn, formerly of Gorillaz and Blur fame. Damon Albarn is an artist who has pretty much always been a factor in my life when it came to the music that I like, even if I didn't know it at the time, and to this day he's probably one of the most admirable artists of his generation to me, and that's all thanks to what he achieved over the course of his career with Blur and of course Gorillaz. But when it comes to Damon's solo work, I've actually never listened to his debut solo album, Everyday Robots, which came out in 2014, so I was curious to hear what Damon Albarn would do in a solo setting on his sophomore album. But while I can respect it, it's ultimately just an okay album. Now, Damon does have a lot going for him in this album setting, since it has some very good somber performances from Damon himself, an interesting atmosphere, and interesting sonic detours that feel kind of inspired by David Bowie's Black Star. But not all of it sticks the landing, or the songs just don't have much about them that's all that replayable for me. Even now I'm struggling to remember what any of these songs sound like, since the songs themselves are just so unimpactful and just very okay generally. It's produced well, and I respect what Damon Albarn tried to do on here, but generally speaking it's just not that interesting of an album. It doesn't really warrant a whole lot of replayable moments in my opinion. I could definitely appreciate what Damon was trying to go for, and while it's pleasant all around, I can't really say it's something that's worth coming back to.
Yeah, I mean, for a new Damon Albarn album, I'd expect a lot more hype and just talk about this album than what I witnessed. I had no idea this was coming out until the day it came out, and after listening to this album, I honestly see no reason to really get hyped or excited. It does so little in its 40-minute runtime. It's just so sparse. Its melancholy instrumentals and soundscapes just really do the bare minimum for me. And I think this project very seldom, showcases anything interesting or unique or breathtaking or groundbreaking. It's just an very atmospheric, but a little substanceless. It feels like, I don't know. It just feels like it's presenting this dark and cryptic world, but it doesn't really build upon it. It doesn't expand upon it. It just kind of feels like it sets an atmosphere and then just stays with it for the rest of it. And also, I maybe it's just me, but Damon just feels a little out of place in this very dark environment. Maybe it's just not what I'm used to from the Park Life Lad.
Park Lad.
Park Lad. Put that on his Wikipedia page. Damon Albarn is a British Park Lad.
Park Lad just sounds like a new breed of human that just sells you drugs in the park.
Yeah. But yeah, in general, it's a little awkward. It's very unmemorable, and honestly, it's just quite weak.
Yeah, I agree. My favourite track from the Nearer the Fountain, More Pure the Stream Flows is the title track. My least favourite track is Polaris, and I gave this album a strong 5 to a light 6.
My favourite track is Polaris. My least favourite track is The Cormorant, and I gave this album a light 5 out of 10.
Alright, next up we have Believe in Me Who Believes in You by Aries. This is the sophomore album from California rapper, singer-songwriter, and producer Aries. This new album here is coming out 2 years after his debut album, Welcome Home, which is an album that I need to re-listen to actually, but from what I remember, I think I enjoyed a fair amount of it, and Aries' more catchy approach to the sounds of emo rap that was influenced by Lil Peep particularly was pretty interesting. Emo rap really isn't in the same place that it was a few years ago, and personally there hasn't been an album in emo rap sound that has particularly blown me away yet. I hope that Aries would come through with a great album this time and massively improve upon what he did in his debut, and while I don't think it's bad, I think that Believe in Me Who Believes in You is pretty hit or miss. Where it comes in, where it's strong, where it hits, it comes in the form of the production, which is often quite good all over this album. I think that Aries' typical blends go over pretty well, even if they seem a little generic, and there's some cool ideas and blends that caught my attention on a few points here. I think vocally Aries is pretty solid all over this album, so he doesn't disappoint on that front, and there's some really solid bangers and fun tracks to be found in the tracklist. But of course, with all that in mind, I think that this album falls flat in some instances. For example, the songwriting, which oftentimes just kind of feels typical and tropey, and whenever it isn't that, there's some lines here and there that just come off kind of awkward and a little corny. There's tracks in this album that almost sound indistinguishable from one another since they're structurally formulaic and generic, and as a whole there were just a lot of tracks on here that didn't blow me away or sound interesting, and they just came off very forgettable. I haven't got much else to say besides that. I think that Believe in Me Who Believes in You is a bit of a sloppy album all in all. It has some great tracks to its name, but most of it's not all that great to me, and it seems like a bit of a misstep for Aries at this point.
Yeah, Aries' debut album, Welcome Home, is, in my opinion, probably the best that emo rap has to offer. His warm and playful production, his infectious yet bittersweet vocals were just a recipe for banger after banger, and that album is still one that I look back at fondly, and I quite regularly come back to. It's one of my favorite projects. I hit my mic, I'm sorry. It's one of my favorite projects of 2018, and one which is also, for me personally, tied with a lot of nostalgia. It accompanied some very drunk nights with friends, I'll tell you that much. So to say I was anticipating his sophomore album would be an understatement. I was dying for new material from Aries. And does it live up to expectations? Yes and no. Believe in Me, Believe in You is still a... Believe in Me Who Believes in You is still a very good project. Well, very good. It's still a good project. That much I, won't strip away from it. But while it doesn't really deviate from the formula that makes Welcome Home so successful, it does feel like the formula is just less effective the second time around. Possibly it's because the instrumentation is a little less memorable. Maybe it's because Aries' hooks and verses are a little, less catchy and infectious. It's just something about this project. It doesn't really, hit the same notes, and it doesn't really strike a chord with me like Welcome Home did. It still has some very good material in it. I mean, if you're a fan of Aries, then again, plenty to like about this project, but I don't think it builds upon the foundation that he set for himself. I think it kind of matches what he already had going for him, but it's just slightly weaker on the production front, slightly weaker on a vocal and lyrical front, and all that adds up to make an album that's just overall slightly weaker. It never quite reaches the highs of tracks like Sayonara or Race Car from his previous album. The closest he gets is the opening track, which is fantastic. It's definitely the highlight of this project, but when the best track is the first track, it's not always a good sign.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Believe in Me Who Believes in You are ETA and When the Lights Go Out. The worst track is Easy, and I gave this album a strong 5.
My favourite tracks are Bounty Hunter, ETA, and Outdated. My least favourite track is Easy, and I give this album a decent 6 out of 10.
Alright, next up we have 30 by Adele. This is the third studio album from the British singer-songwriter Adele, someone who at this stage doesn't really need much of an introduction, since Adele has pretty much been a force in the charts over the past decade. I mean, everyone and their mother has at least heard one Adele song on the radio, or when you went shopping at Tesco. Up to this point, I haven't heard an Adele album. I've definitely heard plenty of the big singles over the years, and I'm pretty sure I heard Easy on Me about 10 fucking times since it came out. I didn't really have any real expectations going to 30, so after giving it a listen, I was fairly indifferent to it. Simultaneously, some of Adele's absolute best songs turn up on 30, but some of her most dull and redundant songs also happen to turn up on here. What Adele does stylistically on a few tracks here is very respectable, but for every stylistically different track, there's about a dozen piano ballads. A lot of the tracks on here just feel like deja vu, since Adele hasn't really varied up much of her lyrical content. She's intimate on here, but I guess it kind of got monotonous very quickly, especially after the third track. I think it's a decently produced album all around, and Adele still sounds great vocally, but most of the tracks just don't have much memorable going on for them. And while I do think that there's some great tracks on here, those moments are few and far in between. Also, I hope that we can agree that out of Adele and Lana Del Rey, Adele had the better trap interlude. So yeah,
that's facts.
I mean, objectively the better one, but Lana's was just funny.
Yeah. Actually, no. The funniness counts.
Fuck it, why not? Alright, there just isn't really much else to say about 30, to be honest. If you like Adele, have 3 kids in a failed marriage, and like drowning your sorrows in wine, then you'll sure as fuck love this. But for now, this is just fine.
Yeah, look, I certainly appreciate Adele as an artist, and I cannot deny her impact on popular music throughout the last decade. But aside from some fantastic singles, most of her studio output has been, at large, rather forgettable. It doesn't apply to any of her projects as much as 30, though, in my opinion. Look, I know not everyone will agree, but I think Easy on Me is a brilliant track. It's beautifully written, it's beautifully performed. But unfortunately, that highs really end with that track. The rest of the album just is really an offensive pop soul, the likes you've heard from Adele and similar artists time and time again. It doesn't really do anything to stand out. It just kind of showcases the fact that Adele can sing very well. It doesn't do much else. The instrumentals are drab. The lyrics, just a lot of the time, don't really stick. And even Adele's vocals are sometimes a little overblown. It's not an awful project, and I imagine that fans of Adele will eat this up without any questions. But to me, it's just meh.
Yeah. My favourite tracks on 30 are Strangers by Nature, My Little Love, and Love is a Game. Worst track is Woman Like Me, and I gave this album a decent to strong 5.
My favourite track is Easy on Me. My least favourite track is Oh My God, and I give this album a light 4 out of 10.
Alright, next up we have Blood Moon 1 by Converge and Chelsea Wolfe. This is the latest and first full-length collaborative effort from Massachusetts mathcore, metalcore, sludge metal and post-hardcore band Converge, and gothic rock singer-songwriter and musician Chelsea Wolfe. Now, this album was probably the last thing that I really expected to be covering this month, but hey, November is a slow month, so that's welcomed. But either way, I was very excited to give this album a listen, given what both artists are like stylistically and, what they can bring to the table for a project. I'm more so familiar with Converge. I've heard a few of their albums, but not enough of them to have much of a strong opinion on them, and I actually haven't checked out a Chelsea Wolfe project yet. I've heard her being mentioned all over the place for years now, and whatever her vibe is as an artist is, nothing but concrete to my opinion of her, I guess. Well, not really. That's kind of... Okay, that's just not a good way to get an opinion on someone's music, but whatever. Either way, the fact that this collaboration exists is promising. It's so promising that I was very excited to check it out. Admittedly, I'm kind of disappointed with the album, but as a whole, I think it's solid on its own. Converge and Chelsea Wolfe pretty much blend some of the sounds and styles that they're typically known for and put them into one setting, and while it may be inconsistent quality-wise, I will admit that the album's production, atmosphere, and cohesiveness is very admirable. I think it sounds great, and there's genuinely some fantastic atmospheres and production that blends with the metallic tone well. Plus, the first 2 tracks on this album are fucking amazing, to be honest. But after that, the Blood Moon 1 just kind of suffers in quality with tracks that aren't particularly interesting or memorable. It's not bad at all, in fact most of the tracks are at the very least decent, but the gap in quality from the best tracks were very noticeable, and the sheer predictability of the project brought it down for me. The ideas got pretty redundant really quickly, and while I think that Chelsea Wolfe and Jacob Bannon were pretty strong vocally, I can't help but feel like something is off with the chemistry of their performances in the midway point of the album. It's kind of hard to describe, but it doesn't feel unison for me. It's a decent fusion of sludge metal and gothic metal, but even if it's interesting in concept, it leaves a lot to be desired.
Yeah, there's a lot to admire about Blood Moon 1. It's definitely a unique album in Converge's discography, as this band, the band really adjusts their sound to suit Chelsea Wolfe's energy and just sound overall. And, this more gothic, slow approach to their sound is definitely executed a lot better here than I may have expected. But even that aside, the result is still definitely something you would expect from Converge. It still has a lot of, a lot of energy and a lot of just intensity packed into the atmospheres and into its more brooding and dense instrumentation. It's an all-around good album. It's a good endeavor from both these artists. But I do think that, while I think the 2 artists definitely play to each other's strengths, I don't think they play to their own strengths as much on here, and I think that leaves a lot to be desired with this project. I don't think I think it's the best thing they could have done together at this point in time. I do think that their chemistry can definitely be built upon if this is the first of many albums. But individually, I think both of these artists have definitely done better stuff in the past. And this really isn't that big of a deal. It's just an album I'm probably going to forget about in a few months' time. But I'm hoping that this relationship between them is something that they can expand upon, because it does show some promise on this project, even if a vast majority of it is just a little forgettable and does fall flat when compared to the best albums from both of these artists.
Yeah. My favourite tracks from Blood Moon 1 are Blood Moon, Viscera of Men, and Deimos. The worst track is Failure Forever, and I gave this album a light 6.
My favourite tracks are Blood Moon and Lord of Liars. My least favourite track is Damon, and I gave this album a light 6.
Alright, next up we have Henke by Richard Dawson and Circle. This is the latest collaborative effort from the English singer-songwriter Richard Dawson and the prolific Finnish rock group Circle. This is the first bit of music that I'm hearing from both artists. I've seen plenty of Richard Dawson's records over the years, but I've never actually gone ahead and given any of his work a listen. And Circle, up to this point, I actually haven't heard of, so I haven't got anything to add there. All I knew was that this album, going into this album, that it was labelled as this art rock, prog rock project that feels very rooted in the peak of the genre in the 70s, and I was very excited to hear it since I like some 70s prog. But after giving it a listen, I just feel very underwhelmed by it personally. It's still cool to see an embrace of prog rock that stems from its 70s roots. in Richard Dawson and Circle's case, we see grooves and sonic palettes and, general songcraft that feels like a tribute to bands from this era. But Henke as a whole just feels like a bland, sterile, and uninspired collection of Genesis worship to my ears. There were some nice instrumental moments here and there, but the whole project just feels very lackluster to me when it comes down to nearly everything about it. Like I mentioned earlier, it feels very derivative of Genesis in particular, in my opinion, which in and of itself isn't a totally bad thing, but it's Genesis worship that's not done well. For one, the production is just so weak across the entire album. It's low impact, it's bland, it's sterile, and it makes the very driving instrumentation throughout the album just very weak and very monotonous. Richard Dawson's vocals are another reason why this album just drags for me. While I don't think Richard's vocals are bad like a lot of people seem to think, he doesn't really do a good job on a lot of these tracks in my opinion. He feels really out of place and awkward a lot of the time, and oftentimes he just comes off very grating for me, which is a given since he's a pretty eccentric vocalist. But I just couldn't get into him on here. So yeah, I don't have too much else to say about it. All in all, I think Henke is a very mixed bag that drags on a lot of the time by how derivative and how sloppy the production and performances are. It's not a bad album by any means, but it just lacks in so many departments to make it worthwhile for me. And for a prog rock album, it just feels so unadventurous.
Richard Dawson's collab with Finnish outfit, Circle is one of the most left field collaborations I've heard all year. But honestly, I fucking love it. I think that the two artists come together to create something unique for Richard Dawson for sure. And it's an album that it takes source material definitely from the 70s. It definitely, a lot of that material definitely isn't all too unique, but I think what it does and what it presents is just a breath of fresh air in the current landscape of music. It kind of reminds me in a weird way of Silk Sonic, where both of the artists in that case collaborate. Both are also collaborative albums, and both see the artists tackle a genre that was at its peak in the 70s and breathe new life into it. And I think that Henke does a similar thing to Silk Sonic in that sense. As someone who's fairly familiar with Richard Dawson's output over the last few years, I could have never imagined something like this would have been in the works. I didn't even think this would be something that would really suit his style all that much, but I think that while his sound in recent years has definitely been more mellow, more subdued, and his voice a little more subtle and just somber throughout, I didn't expect this grand prog rock odyssey to come out of him, and I think that he really does shine on here. I think his voice is amazing. I think his energy throughout the tracks is just fantastic, and it adds a lot to the mythical and just epic nature of the album. And the instrumentation is just so vibrant. The spacey prog rock instrumentation it's crazy. The passages are winding and interesting. The production is just meticulous. The instrumentation is just so clean and pristine throughout. It's so memorable. There's so many moments that just leave me speechless. It does everything I want a good prog rock album to do, and it's something that I haven't really heard from any artists in recent years, and especially not from a Richard Dawson collaboration. I think that Circle really did carry a lot of this project with their instrumentation, but I do think that Richard definitely held his own as well. Obviously, aside from Black Midi this year, prog rock has been quite dry in terms of new content, and it is a genre that is near and dear to my heart, so maybe I do have a little bit of bias to this, but I think this album really captures the magic of 70s and 80s prog perfectly, and it's a fantastic record. It's one of the most unique projects I've heard this year, not in a sense that nothing like this has ever come out, but it's just an album that I could have never predicted would happen. It's just pure prog rock goodness, and I really enjoy it.
Man, just go listen to Genesis or something, man.
Nah, I can listen to Genesis and this.
Nah, that's a bit of an L. Right.
Nah. Crazy.
Yeah. Nah. Alright. Alright, my favourite track from Henke is Silphium. My least favourite track is Lily, and I gave this album a decent 5.
My favourite tracks are Cooksonia, Ivy, and Silphium. My least favourite track is Methuselah, and I give this album a light 8 out of 10.
Okay, we're moving on to the last two albums of the recap, and we're first going to talk about the Making Magic album 2. The Making Magic 2 album by DJ Sabrina, the Teenage DJ. This is the 7th studio album from the UK house producer, DJ Sabrina, the Teenage DJ. If you remember last year, Sabrina came out with her 3-hour-long house opus, Charmed. That album was our introduction to Sabrina's work, and what a fucking introduction at that. The runtime may be demanding, but it's so worth it for me, since the ideas, the samples, and the sheer fun that radiates from that album is fantastic given its runtime. Well, it's been a year now, and she's after hitting us with 2 albums actually, the other record being The Other Realm, which was more of a sonic detour for her. It's still house inspired, but more so from other strands of it. Plus, with this being a sequel to her 2017 album, Making Magic, I had high expectations since that album is fucking great. It's outsider house in its purest form, and I love that thing. So yeah, with those expectations in mind, I was hyped to hear what Sabrina would offer this time around, and while I do feel like it's a bit flawed, it's still a good helping of house music. Now, my only real gripe with Making Magic 2 is that I feel like I'm getting deja vu from this album a bit. It's kind of to be expected when it comes to the kind of music that Sabrina makes, but for me, I just feel like Sabrina has made a couple more fulfilling and consistently memorable behemoths of house albums already before. And for me, Making Magic 2, while good, is a tad bit redundant on that front. To be honest, that's all I really have to say negatively about it, but because DJ Sabrina delivers on another solid helping of lengthy house jams. Her style of sample-heavy, triumphant, and upbeat house remains very potent and incredibly enjoyable for a lot of the tracks here. The grooves, the samples, and the production weave together to create such a strong sense of wonder and nostalgia, and even when it isn't totally wowing me, I'm still really enjoying it. Sabrina's music always sounds fun, and Making Magic 2 is no exception, since the tunes and the mood of this whole album is just, fun. So, yeah, I don't have too much else to say about it. It's a very solid helping of lengthy house jams once again, and even though it's not my favourite project from her, it's still a very enjoyable one that has some fantastic tracks to its name.
I fucking love this album, but before we get into this album, you briefly mentioned it, but I also want to just mention again that DJ Sabrina released a second 90-minute long album on the 26th of November, same day as this, which was also very good. 4 hours of music spanning 2 albums released in one day is just mind-boggling. But for DJ Sabrina, it's just business as usual. The other project, The Other Realm, I definitely also recommend that album. It definitely is a little bit of a new direction for DJ Sabrina. Definitely recommend. Back to Making Magic 2. This album is incredible. Honestly, and what I'm about to say is no exaggeration, I think that DJ Sabrina, the Teenage DJ, is the best thing to happen to electronic music since Daft Punk. Making Magic, Charmed, Making Magic 2, The Other Realm, she releases these absolute behemoths of electronic albums, and they're all so consistent, so incredible. The highs on all of these projects are among the best electronic tracks I've heard ever. Even the highlights on this album, like Being Alone, that song is just incredible. It's one of the best electronic albums I've heard in the last few years. And she just releases tracks like these non-stop. She's still relatively early into her career. That I can only imagine where she's going to go if she can just release 4 hours of music in one day like it's nothing. Charmed has grown to be one of my favorite albums over the last few years. It's just everything she releases, to me, just turns to gold. And Making Magic 2 is no exception. I think this album is absolutely beautiful. If you've heard the original Making Magic, you're in for a very similar aesthetic on its sequel. It's a very nostalgia-drenched, sample-heavy and blissful journey through uplifting house bangers and just dreamlike soundscapes and atmospheres. It's 2.5 hours long. But that 2.5 hour just flies. It's an absolute blast every second of the way. It at times feels like an out-of-body experience, and it feels like an album that's larger than life. It's just so immensely beautiful, yet so fun and just uplifting throughout. When Charmed was released this time last year, it really, brought a lot of comfort and just fun to what was perhaps the most lonesome and desolate winter we've all experienced in ever. And now that we're in for round 2, she releases another great album, and Thank you, DJ Sabrina, for making the world a little less insane in these weird times. This album's just breathtaking. It's immense. It's incredible. It's gorgeous. And even though it's 2.5 hours long, it's still an album experience that I wish would never end. It still feels too short. I love it.
Alright, my favourite tracks from the Making Magic 2 album are Wheels in Motion, Being Alone and Feeling Lonely. My least favourite track is Paradise, and I gave this album a light 7.
My favorite tracks are Be Ready, Lose Myself, and Being Alone. I do not have any least favorite tracks. I do not have any least favorite tracks in a 2.5 hour album. I give this album a strong 8.
Alright, next up we have our final album. We have The Light Emitting Diamond Cutter Scriptures by Rap Ferreira. This is the third studio album under the Rap Ferreira name from Tennessee rapper and poet Milo. This is also the second album that Milo is dropping this year. The other album he dropped was Bob's Son, which came out on the 1st of January of this year, and we covered it when it came out. My first impressions weren't all that great, to be honest. I felt like that project in particular was just very blasé and uneventful, and it was especially disappointing for me since I really loved his Purple Moonlight Pages record from 2020, which was a fantastic helping of lyrically dense weirdo jazz rap. This album here is very short, at only 28 minutes, and while I was hoping for an improvement, I had a slight feeling that this would be a bit of a throwaway project, and for me, it's somewhat that, but also not really. It has some admirable qualities about it, but nothing that's like crazy or mind-blowing. Now, where the album gets the thumbs up from me is in the production and the rapping from Milo, which is still very good to me. The production, especially while not being anything particularly new from Milo, is still really solid. If you like your dusty jazz rap beats with a bit of an abstract twist, then I don't see how you won't be disappointed. I fail to see how you'll be disappointed by this. God, I can't speak. Milo's lyricism is just as dense and as odd as you'd expect. His hectic, calculated and offbeat flow is still pretty slick, and he sounds good over these beats. The main issue with this album, though, is that it's a bit of a forgettable one, and not much of the material on here is truly standout for Milo, in my opinion. Like, it's very dense, and it works for being something that you could have on in the background, but I probably won't remember any of these tracks when thinking about my favourite rap songs or albums of the year, to be honest. It has its good tracks, but ultimately it's forgettable, and it's kind of a far cry from some of Rap Ferreira's best work, particularly Purple Moonlight Pages.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I don't want to say that this project missed a mark or anything. It's just that there's something about this album that just doesn't stick. It feels just too sparse. It feels too short to leave any sort of lasting impression. And, while Milo's performances and songwriting are undoubtedly the highlight here and, are as solid as ever, the instrumentation just really does nothing for me. It's not bad at all, but it just reminds me of if Earl Sweatshirt's Some Rap Song was just worse in every conceivable way and just less immediate, less hard-hitting, less memorable, and just more bland and sparse. And that's what this project feels like to me. It just feels too bland and sparse. It really is just Milo running the show, and the instrumentals just do nothing to favor him. I still think that, Rap Ferreira, sorry, I said the Milo word. He's not Milo anymore. Rap Ferreira, I still think he's a key figure in hip-hop today. But I just feel like this project will go down as one that is definitely not remembered as highlight for him, as a highlight for the genre in general. It just feels very nondescript.
Yep. Alright, my favourite tracks from the Light Emitting Diamond Cutter Scriptures are Contrapuntal, Brother Mazoon Library Card, and Humboldt Park Gibberitos. God damn it. And the worst track is Wedding Cake 8s, and I gave this album a 6 out of 10.
My favorite track is Humboldt Park Gibberitos, and my least favorite track is Contrapuntal, and I gave this album a decent 5.
Okay, now we're going to move on to our worst albums, best albums, and best songs of the month segment. We're going to be cutting some of these down because we only had 12 albums to cover this episode, so it'd be kind of pointless putting in more on an already kind of compact set of albums, so it's whatever. We'll start with the worst album because we only have one for this category, and for me, the worst album of the month is 30 by Adele.
Yeah, same. It's not even that bad, for being honest.
It really isn't. It's a 5. Like, Jesus Christ. Oh, what has November been making us do? For fuck's sake. Okay,
Yeah,
so
it
now
feels
we're gonna
too
move.
mean.
Right, now we're gonna move on to the best albums. So we have three for this category. At my number three, I have the Making Magic album, the Making Magic 2 album, DJ Sabrina the Teenage DJ.
My number three is Silk Sonic, An Evening with Silk Sonic.
My number two is Crawler by Idols.
My number two is Richard Dawson and Circle, Henke.
And my number one is An Evening with Silk Sonic by Silk Sonic.
My number one is DJ Sabrina the Teenage DJ, Making Magic 2.
Okay, let's move on to the best songs of the month. I only have two honorable mentions here. I have Beachland Ballroom by Idols and Blood Moon by Converge and Chelsea Wolfe. But my favorite song of the month is Smoking Out the Window by Silk Sonic.
Some shout outs go to Silk Sonic, 777, Richard Dawson, and Circle Ivy. And honestly, I could not pick a winner between these two. My two favorite tracks of the month are Taylor Swift's All Too Well 10-minute version and DJ Sabrina the Teenage DJ Being Alone.
Alright, and that's going to conclude today's episode of the Taped Podcast. Thank you guys so much for checking it out. We really hope that you enjoyed. What were some of your favourite albums from November? What were some of your least favourites? Please let us know. Of course, necessary links in the description will be to our own individual YouTube channels and our Album of the Year and Rate Your Music pages. The Cassette Tapes Award Show will be going ahead very soon, so be on the lookout for that. We're very excited to put that out. And yeah, with that in mind, my name's been MickyT.
I've been Nostalgia.
Peace.
Peace and love. Alright. It's a little annoying because my Audacity. How long is your file? Your Audacity? 57. Yeah, I lost about 10 minutes of audio because my Audacity stopped recording because of storage space or some shit. I don't know. It's when I was talking about Henke and Converge, but I'll just throw in the Craig audio for that. A little cringe, a little sad. There's a Chinese waiting for me downstairs. Let's go. I I've been fucking having it way too often because when I come home at fucking 8, I'm not arsed cooking. I think we'll leave it, man. I struggling to get through this month. Yeah, let's just we'll do it for Christmas next year. Hopefully, we'll be less busy. Right. Peace, dude. Yeah. Peace.